And now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's fashion, Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And now, here's Ted.
Thanks so much, Becky, and welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this week. And by the way, for those of you people who have jumped on to our website, which is tedwallachin.ca, and have entered your name and sent off some questions and comments, I hope you enjoyed the answers that you received. And please do, if you haven't done so, visit our website. And if you've got questions or comments, and we're going to have some neat contests coming up in the future. I'm excited about that. We'll tell you more about that as we move along. And as we move along, seasonally at least, no doubt everyone listening now has been watching the weather around them changing, hopefully for the better. We want to find out, as we usually do, what may be in store for the upcoming months. And in our case, of course, as we sail through spring into summer, we decided that we would contact our friend, senior climatologist from Environment Canada, David Phillips, who's also an award-winning novelist and or an author at least, and he is a member of the Order of Canada. Dave Phillips, good to see you. Is it hard to believe that it's been 55 years?
You know, it is. I have very fond memories of my beginning. I didn't want to be a weather person. I wanted to be a teacher. I had a job lined up as a teacher in high school, my old high school. And hey, I decided to come to Toronto from Windsor, where I was born and raised. And so it was my first job was doing research on the Great Lakes. And then I sort of cultivated my job into one of really trying to answer people's questions about the weather. And I've been there a long time, but hey, I still have the enjoyment of what I do. I mean, my job is to keep the conversations in Canada humming when people want to talk about the weather.
Well, you know, you can almost say. I mean, you're not a forecaster per se. You're not a meter. You're a senior climatologist, but people still think of Dave Phillips as that's the guy who's going to tell you what the weather is. So we could always say something like Dave Phillips pissing people off for more than 55 years now.
Well, that's right. You know, I mean, and I take that seriously. I mean, I
know you
Canadians do
too.
I mean, they really. I think one thing unites us as Canadians, Ted, is our need to know the weather. You know, we might believe, most Canadians believe we're only right 50% of the time, and we claim we're 90% of the right on today's forecast. But in terms of, they still keep listening to you because of the fact there is that need to know. I mean, I think one of the most famous statistics I love to quote is 93% of Canadians consult the weather forecast every day of the year. I mean, I often wonder, what do the other 7% do? I mean, they sniff the air or they ask somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Or those are the people who are walking around in February with a ski jacket and shorts.
That's right.
They're sort of confused and they don't really care. I'm not sure what that is. But you know, it's interesting because you know it's like you have to, because when we go through these transitional periods of time, when we go from the summer into the fall, into the winter, and we transition through spring into the summer, we can have some really, really wacky weather, and so different from day to day that literally one day you wake up and the high is 26 degrees, and the next day it's only going to be 9 with rain and wind, which means it's going to feel like it's 5. So now you're not only wearing a jacket, you may even have a sweater underneath, and meanwhile the day before you were in shorts and in a golf shirt. So we do go through these wild swings, these ups and downs.
Absolutely.
So that's why one of the reasons,
well,
right?
Truly, Ted. I mean, and this is, I think the spring is usually the worst season for that because, you know, winter wants to hold on and summer wants to get a foothold. And I've never seen, in my 55 years, I've never seen a month of April like we've had this year in southern Ontario. My gosh, where you could have in Ottawa the worst ice storm in 25 years, and the next week you're talking about temperatures you've never seen before in April, in 30 degrees. And what we're seeing this week, and then it's a return back to kind of cooler weather. I mean, it's this week in the Toronto GTA area, we could have a temperature of a high of 5. Well, my gosh, 4 days ago, the high was 29. I mean, do the math. I mean, that's like
That's
two
what I'm
dozen
saying.
temperature degrees. And so, it's the muscle shirt and tank top, and now it's the snow pants and balaclavas. I mean, it's
And I often think to myself, I mean, if you think it's confusing us as human beings, we at least can read about it.
oh,
We know that it's coming. We know how to prepare for it. Pity the poor animals, and well, they're a lot smarter than we are, I think, maybe in some cases. But pity the flowers and the trees and the bushes, and they're ready to sprout up. And suddenly, you look and you've got tulips in your garden, and the next day later, it's covered in snow, and they're thinking, what am I supposed to
Well,
do?
absolutely, and I think that is where we're seeing some of the hardship of this kind of. I mean, it's a conversation piece for us, but boy, I think of the Apple industry. I mean, some in parts of Ontario, the apples were
Hmm.
not just budding; they were blossoming. And then, if you return to a winter kind of conditions, it could kill those blossoms, and so you end up with not having an apple season at all. I mean, we saw that in 2012 where we went from warm temperatures in March to freezing cold and a $100 million loss to the apple industry. I say to people, go to the garden center, but do window shopping. I mean, don't buy anything because hey, it's you can't sort of suggest that we've seen the end of wintry like weather. Now, at this time of the year, you might get a return of winter. It lasts maybe 1 or 2 or 3 days, but it
Hmm.
still could be frost or it could be flurries. I mean, where I live, north of Toronto, we're expecting 5 to 10 centimeters of snow this week, and people had already given up to it.
Yeah, well, and you know what's really interesting when you walk into the grocery store these days, David, and of course the price of everything has just skyrocketed, and some fruits and vegetables are going to go up even more because of droughts and conditions where they are typically grown. And I think that you're going to see a lot more people turn to their garden and start growing their own foods because of frustration over the costs of foods in grocery stores. And with that in mind, that means people are going to be paying more attention to meteorologists and are going to become more and more frustrated when the weather that they need and want isn't there for
Oh,
them.
absolutely, Ted. I mean, I think one way we deal with weather is to, create our own weather, or at least the conditions that we can take advantage of it, and not expect or expect the produce to come in from distant areas. Because the world is smaller now. I mean, what we're hearing about on the other side of the world is important to us because we buy product from those, or we have people who live in those areas that we know, and so I think this notion the world is smaller, I think there's a lot of truth to it. And I think that people, one of the ways they can deal with these kind of the up and down, the backward kind of aspect of weather is to grow your own product. I think there's a lot of sense to that, or make adjustments to it. We see that not just with growing a product, but we see it also with some of the changes that we've seen with climate change, with the kind of effects that it's having on people, places, and things, and
Hmm.
unlike ever before. I mean, I used to think that these things occurred in Bangladesh and Botswana and Bolivia, but my gosh, I look at it, these are things happening in Burlington and Brandon and Burnaby. It's in our own backyard that
Yeah.
we're seeing these incredible kinds of events. Ted, we used to think that this was part of the Arctic. That ice melting and permafrost thawing and boy, we're seeing in our own backyard that we're being challenged more and more by weird, wild, and wacky weather.
Yeah. Senior climatologist for Environment Canada, David Phillips, is my guest. Since you started doing this, 50, 55 years ago, the word climate change wasn't really bandied about much then. Maybe in your circles it was, certainly not in public circles. It is today. Do you think it's worse today than we thought it was going to be 10 years ago? And do you think it's going to be worse 10 years from now?
Well, when I started 50 years ago, I mean, people talked about climate change, but it was sort of like, well, every 100,000 years you have an ice age. Summers were hot and
Hmm.
winters were cold. And what we've seen in recent years is a dramatic change to our basic climate. But what we've really seen more of, and I think this is when the public began to pay attention to it, realizing that it was a serious issue, is that when climate change affected the weather, not just the climate was warmer or sea levels were rising, kind of a slow, relentless kind of change, but when we actually began to see the stuff out our windows, the weather was different. Storms were stormier, floods were floodier, droughts were droughtier. That is really, I think, when people began to think, oh my gosh, it's not just something that our grandparents had to deal with. We're seeing things
Hmm.
that we've never, even in my lifetime, we've seen changes that are quite different, and the impacts that it's had, Ted. I mean, the number of deaths from heat waves, the incredible flooding that's going in our cities. We have a new flood in cities. It's not the river flooding like we had from Hurricane Hazel in '54. It's the urban flood. It's the fact there's too much cement, asphalt, and building material. When it rains, because it's warmer, and so you're going to get more doses of rain when it chooses to rain, you're going to have more of these intersection flooding and basement flooding, and so the impacts of weather is far greater, and it's not just something on the other side of the world. It's affecting us now here in our own country, and I think people are waking up to that. So, interesting point you ask is that, well, is the weather changing or the climate changing faster now than it was, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago? And what's interesting about that, Ted, is what scientists said 20 years ago we're seeing happen now. In fact, I think we underestimated some of the things. One of the things that we're seeing dramatically change is the rise in sea level. Nobody could have predicted the kind of ice cap melting in Greenland and Antarctica, which is causing the sea levels to rise. And that has greater impacts because that same old storm on the Atlantic, for example, is pushing more water, which is higher, into the coastal areas. And so we're seeing much more inland flooding than we did. So our models, I think, were right 20 years ago. All that really we're saying now is that it is what we expected, and we should expect more of that, and even more dramatic. But what we've seen around the world is a 1 degree temperature increase, Ted. And think about all of the misery, hardship, and misfortune we've seen. What's it going to be like with a 3 degree rise? I think I could only imagine that storms are going to get worse. People are going to be more impacted, and it's going to have an effect on people where they live
Hmm.
and security issues. It's going to be continue to be a big issue for years to come.
Okay, David. So, what can we here in Canada, in the United States, and in North America in general, and in most parts of the world, what can we do? I mean, when you look at the emissions that we put out here in Canada, they're almost meaningless, really. You know, comparatively speaking, it's like somebody said to me. They said, "Well," he says, "nothing is going to change unless China changes, parts of Africa change, India changes, and the United States. Canada can't do anything about global warming. No, even I hate that expression. Climate change.
Well, I think there's some truth to that, Ted. I mean, I think that certainly we just a drop in the bucket compared to other countries in the world in terms of our
Yeah.
emissions to the atmosphere. But that doesn't necessarily prevent us from doing something about it, because I really believe that if you do something about it, you can make yourself more profitable, safer communities, and you can maybe shame other countries in doing what they do. I remember when the Green Revolution started, people said it's going to be a job killer. The unions were against it because they saw it was going to just kill jobs, and what it turned out to be was a job creator. I mean, we saw the economies improved in areas that went green and went ahead of it. But certainly, we need to encourage everybody to do this. But my sense is two things. One is that we need to cut back to decarbonize as much as we can. But Ted, I'm not very optimistic about that. I haven't seen any numbers to really show what we need to do to make an effect. But I think it's what we need to do is to do more adapting, to prepare for the kind of changes. You know, you can do all the blowing you do doesn't stop that storm from coming your way. But by responding and preparing for it, you can prevent it from becoming a disaster. So I think we can improve, make our cities, our communities, our neighborhoods safer, more weatherproof by building up our infrastructure and really
Yep.
preventing those kinds of of extremes from occurring.
I mean, you talked about how you used to think that those kinds of problems existed, in third world countries as opposed to in the quote the modern world. In for example, a month or so ago, if less than that, maybe they had record rains in Fort Lauderdale
Oh,
that shut the airport down, and the streets were. I mean, cars were immobilized. uh, am I making up words, by the way? The cars couldn't move. You couldn't move. People were
oh.
taking rafts and boats down the street. And that's the kind of thing, had that happened in a quote, third world country, that damage would have been
Oh,
tenfold. But at least Fort Lauderdale had some infrastructure to protect
right,
itself.
and they had the sort of the emergency measures system in place. They could recover
Yeah.
quicker. But my gosh, Ted, that was not even during the hurricane season. That was just
No.
during a kind of a spring storm that stalled. And one of the things we've seen more of is that I often said the best thing about Canadian weather is that it hits and runs. It doesn't stand around and clobber you like it does in other parts of the country. What we're seeing, Ted,
Hmm.
is that severe weather in Canada is slowing down. So it has more time to spread that misery than it was. And we saw Hurricane Fiona last year was very much like that. Normally, hurricanes would spend 6 hours in Canadian territory. They hit and they run. That would spend a day and a half. And of course, much more wind damage, much more flooding. And we saw the impacts of that. It was one of the most expensive hurricane disasters in Canadian history. And we saw just a month later Hurricane Ian in the United States. I mean, it devastated. That Fiona was a multi-million-dollar disaster. Ian was a multi-billion-dollar disaster. And so what we're
Wow.
seeing more of these, and they're lasting longer, and we just need to be prepared for it. And think not to think about it that's it's a 1 in 100 year storm. I talk to mayors and councillors, and they say, well, David, we were hit last year with a 100 year storm. We have 99 more years to go. Hey, it doesn't work that way, you see. And so just because you had it once, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen in next year. So my sense is the fact that it's happened means there's a good chance it could happen again. And I think what we need to do is to recognize that and prepare for it. And I think we can make our properties more communities more attractive. People want to
Hmm.
develop in those communities that are weatherproof and have safeguarded themselves, and homes have more value to them when you can tell buyers that, hey, we've weatherproofed our home against flooding and things like this. It's such an easy kind of thing to do, and all you have to do is just go to someone in the insurance industry said to me, well, if you just go to Home Depot for 3 weekends during the week, during the summer, you could probably prevent 90% or 30% of the flooding that could occur in your home. So my sense is there are some common things that people can do, not just wait for the officials to bail you out, but you can take action in your own hands, like what you said about growing your own crops in your backyard. You can weatherproof your house to safeguard it and add more value to it. And I think people need to take ownership of it.
Ted Wallachin returns in a moment.
Do you have an upcoming wedding on your calendar? Hey, it's Ted Wallachin for Tom's Place. If you're the father of the bride or a special guest who needs an elegant new suit or tuxedo, Tom will help you get ready for the spotlight. And if you're the lucky groom, Tom is a friend of the groom and the best man to help you dress the entire wedding party for your special day. Whether it's formal or informal, destination wedding, traditional or contemporary, tailored suits, or classic tuxedos with all the accessories, why rent a tux when it's so affordable to buy a classic that'll take you to events for years to come? Find out more at Tom's Place in Kensington Market. No one can dress you better or save you more than our wedding specialists. And don't forget, enter our wonderful wedding contest at toms-place.com to win a $500 credit for your wedding party outfits. Tom's Place will suit you. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866 309 0387. That's 1-866 309 0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Wallachin.
David Phillips is the senior climatologist for Environment Canada. Some people believe that what we're seeing is the beginning of the change, that what we're seeing to the south of us is now progressing, and what exists in middle America soon will be part of the lower part of Canada and eventually just keep moving south. I mean, do you see that? I mean, have we, are here in Ontario, are we going to be subject to hurricanes, and we get subject to tornadoes
Ted,
like they are in southern
Ted,
states?
you raise a very good point, and I've said this for many years. I said, if we look, say, by 2050, 2060, our model suggests that we will inherit the climate of the United States 600 kilometers to the south. And people in Toronto say, oh, you mean we'll be like Kentucky? I'll say yes. Bluegrass. No, no, no. Kentucky gets more F5 tornadoes than any other state of the Union. And we've only had one ever F5 tornado in Canada, hit in southern Manitoba. We've never seen it in southern Ontario. So my sense is you may get what you hope for, and it's not what you really want. And so the United States gets more severe weather than any other country in the world. And so we think we get a lot, but it pales by U.S. standards. For example, they get on average about 1,200 tornadoes a year. We get about 100 tornadoes a year, and usually they're the little guys. So my sense is that we will see more of this crossing the border and not checking in. They'll just come naturally. And so we'll see storms will be stormier. We could get hurricanes that last longer. They stay longer together in Canadian waters. And even some of our misery, like freezing rain. We saw the freezing rain in Quebec and Ottawa in April. Well, they said, okay, we'll be Miami of the North, won't we? And so we'll be able to see the end of freezing rain. Not. When your average temperature in the wintertime is -8 and you now are -2, you're going to be near that sweet zone of freezing rain, ice pellets, and rain or snow. I mean, -8, it's only going to be snow. Just shovel it, plow it, and push it. But when it's the temperature of the winter is that much warmer, you're going to get that mixed bag of precipitation. And so our model suggests we might see 60% more freezing rain occurrences in 50 years as opposed to now.
Ooh. I gotta go put a sweater on. You just giving me the chills. Is there anything that you've seen over the last year that really took you aback in terms of climate change and weather?
I think
that we've
Yeah, I
experienced?
think for Ted, for some of the surprises for me is the fact that what we're seeing are some of these extremes. They're 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 not just they're occurring back to back. It used to be that farmers would have a plan. They'd say, well, okay, we expect a dry year and a wet year. Once every 35 years. You see, so that's
Right.
our sort of business plan that takes that into consideration. What we're seeing in some areas, Ted, is some of the wettest years ever, followed by the driest years ever. I mean, that is back to back to back kind of misery. I mean, you can't farm successfully with those kind of extremes. I mean, it's a different kind of business plan, and you're not set up for it. So my sense is that what we're seeing are these more extremes. Whatever happened to normal weather? And we plan everything based on normal weather. It's what our parents and teachers told us we should expect. We're just not seeing that, Ted, because everything, our policies, our plans, our infrastructures are based on normal weather, normal conditions. But you can't sort of plan your community to withstand the 500-year event. It's just too over designed. So you accept some kind of a risk. But boy, when you get these kind of extremes occurring back to back with nothing normal, it's almost as if we don't have Goldilocks weather anymore. It's either one extreme or the other. I think the other thing, Ted, that has sort of surprised me is that some of these extremes are just not one faceted. They depend upon others. We've seen like large hailstones, and they occur with strong winds. Well, strong winds make
Mm.
those hailstones much more damaging. Or what we've seen
Yep.
on for example, in a good example is British Columbia, where we saw that terrible drought and that heat wave had no effect on the following fall's the flood of floods. But what it did, Ted, is because it destroyed the vegetation, it made the landscape such when the rains came in November, in December, there was no percolation, or there was clearly runoff. The water went where it wanted to go. And so even though the heat and the drought had no effect on the floods, it did in the sense that it changed the landscape. So you ended up with the worst flooding in their history. So you had the worst drought, the worst heat wave, and then the flooding all in the same year. And so we're seeing that kind of a back to back kind of thing. And so what used to occur are talk about in the Arctic about, hey, the effects of the Arctic climate change on the Arctic. We're seeing it more in the south, and I think that is becoming more of a consequence for all of us because it's hitting close to home.
Okay. Mr. Phillips, we've come to the portion of our broadcast where it's time for what I like to call a dose of Dave. Not to be confused with a dose from Dave. That's a totally different podcast. Let's take a look and see what this upcoming warmer weather may look like. We'll take a look at Southern Ontario and take it across Canada and in North America in general, if you would,
Now,
sir.
are you talking about the current situation, or when I won't be around 50 years from now?
No, 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 no. Let's deal with the current
Oh, gee.
situation here.
No, I'd rather talk about.
Let's look at the summer of 23.
Well, I would rather talk 50 years from now because then I know I won't
Yeah.
be around to hear all the complaints about how wrong I was. But hey,
All right. Okay.
what we're going to deal with across the country because of a lingering kind of La Nina, we had this last 3 winters, a little cooler starting. Spring's always reluctant to arrive in Canada, and we've seen that play out this year totally. Now, fortunately, the summer will have no bearing on what the kind of spring is going has been. That's a good. I wish it was. We'd have this thing all figured out. But the models seem to suggest, Ted, that this coming summer, from coast to coast to coast, will be warmer than normal. Now, hey, saying warmer than normal is pretty good. We can't say how much warmer. We're not going to say it's going to be excruciatingly hot and people are going to be dying in the streets. I mean, no
Hmm.
model can say that. We just know that the factors suggest that it's a greater chance that it's going to be warmer than cooler, and precipitation. Now, if it is warmer, you certainly need to have more precipitation. That may be the issue. We don't always get the precipitation we need. And it's often heavy amounts in areas you don't need it, and other areas like farmers who need it may not get it. So that is still problematic. I think the other thing, because we're moving to an El Nino, this is a warm water in the Pacific, it tends to make the hurricane season in the Atlantic a little quieter. Not zero, and it doesn't mean that you might get hit by the worst hurricane ever and in a quiet season. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're safe. But the number of hurricanes that we've seen in recent years has been way up, and sort of the winds from an El Nino tend to cut the tops off of these storms that develop in the Atlantic. So the models seem to suggest we'll have fewer hurricanes this year, or tropical storms, than we've had in the last 2 or 3 years. So that may be good news from that point of view. But hey, we will get our share of tornadoes. We get usually 100 in Canada, and we get most in Ontario. And but we will get a new word we learned last year, derecho. These are these strong winds fields that are like tornadoes, but the winds all blow in the same direction. We had that on the long weekend last May, and it brought down cost $100 billion in terms of, or hundred no, $1 billion in terms of losses into Ontario. But really, the loss of trees was just devastating. I mean, that tree in your front yard that is the
Hmm.
swing for generations, is the shade and the comfort, it was gone. And I think that's the
Yeah.
real tragedy. It's hard to put a price on a family tree. So my sense is that we'll have summer, and it will be there's no volcano exploding, so it won't be the year we canceled summer. I think it will be, and I guarantee you, we'll be complaining about the heat and humidity as much as we always have.
Yeah, absolutely. We're fine. We're funny people that
We
way, aren't we?
are.
The one thing that there was a shortage of, it seemed to me, during part of this past spring, this early spring, late winter, was a lack of sunshine. I mean, there were
Oh,
days we went 5, 6 days in a row, and it was like living under a 10-watt light bulb. You
Ted,
know?
you've got a great memory. That's absolutely right. Here we out of winter, and that to me stood out to me as one of the calling cards of this particular winter. It was the gloomiest, the doomiest, the dankest winter
Mm,
we have seen. And that can be very uplifting. My wife always says, well, can't it be in the winter mild and sunny? I says, no, it can be cold and sunny or cloudy and mild. So we had a warmer than normal winter, but it
yeah.
didn't make up for the fact that it seemed like a Vancouver kind of winter, just day after
Yes, it
day
did.
of overcast and cloud. And people, it was almost like the whole population suffered from seasonal adjustment disorder. Just wasn't those
Hmm.
10% of the people that need therapy for lack of sunshine. We all needed that. And to go along with that, it was one of the wettest, more wet days than any other
Yeah.
winter. Hey, even a little bit more snow. So it didn't have the cold temperatures, but I think in some cases, Ted, that would have been a breakthrough. That would have been, I think you could put up with some Arctic air if you could see the sun for 8 hours a day in the summer, in the
Well,
wintertime.
precisely because there were those days. I recall when waking up and going outside and looking, my gosh, it's -22 with the wind chill. But then I step outside and I look and I think, okay, well, I don't work outside. I don't have to wait by the bus stop. And I know a lot of people do. I'm fortunate I just get in my car. And once you get in your car and the heater's on and the sun is shining and the roads are dry, well, it's a
It
glorious day.
is.
Unless you're outside, because that wind is cutting through your clothing and it's freezing.
Yes. No, clearly, you described it so well. I mean, that's why on the prairies, my gosh, as long as that wind is blowing, you can put up with that kind of a situation. But boy, if it's windy, that wind chill is and I love to walk in the wintertime, and boy, I found a lot of moments this year. It was not sunny enough, or it was even on days
No.
that it was windy. Wasn't a great. I mean, hey, it was we saved money on our home heating bills because it was less cold. But I think we would have given up some of that up if we had some bright, sunny, uplifting kind of days. We needed
Yeah.
that.
Any part of this country or to our neighbors to the south in the U.S. That should be wary of what may be headed in their way, weather-wise?
Well, I think it's the situation. It's a forecast for all places. I mean, everybody has their cross to bear. There's no place that is safe from the ravages and the vagaries of climate. Fortunately, I think if you were sort of inviting a question about where is the best place in Canada to retire, I think the Okanagan for me would be. That's where you get, you don't get the rain of Vancouver, but you get some sun and it's dry. I think that, but then, hey, you get forest fires and
Yeah.
smoke, and sometimes those are not their doing. Sometimes it's not the fires in their backyard, but it's California fires, that smoke coming
Hmm.
northward and fumigating communities in the Okanagan. So hey, it's a global issue, weather, and it's not our own doing many times, and we have to be aware of it.
Yeah. Has this ever happened to you? You catch yourself, you're on the way out of the house, and you're thinking, well, you know what? I'm not going to take an umbrella. I know the guy in the radio said take an umbrella, the forecast says, but I don't believe those guys. Then you get outside and boom, then the rain hits.
Oh, it does to
And you
me.
catch yourself for thinking, why did I believe those meteorologists? I should know better.
Well, that's it, and that's why I have to mask up when, because people are thinking, well, you should know, and my wife is very critical of it. I ask her, she asked me about the forecast, and I just know it's just might be a bummer of a forecast. But I Ted, I always, here's my little tip for you, is that when I hear a 30% chance of rain, I never take an umbrella. Now, anything above 30%, you won't hear 50%, but certainly anything 60% above, hey, I'll put I'll put an umbrella in my hip pocket or carry it in my hand,
Yeah.
so I can believe the forecast. But it's not, and surprisingly, it doesn't mean what most people think it means. 30% doesn't mean 30% of the time it's going to rain, or it doesn't mean 30% of your area is going to rain. It means the confidence of the meteorologist, the forecaster, is on similar situations like that. How often do we get rain? And so 30% is, I'm willing to take my chances with 30%.
Right. And people should understand as well that when, because I know when I worked in radio and I'd read off a weather forecast and people, they give me a hard time about it. I said, look, I don't write them. I just read them. But I know, but I know what you're saying. I understand your frustration. But you remember when I say, there's a good chance of rain, 60% chance of rain, um, and it rains, but it only rains in the west part of Toronto. And people out in the east complain and say, why did you say it was going to rain? I canceled my golf
Oh,
tournament and it didn't rain at all.
it,
Well, because just because you say it's going to rain in Toronto, it doesn't mean it's going to cover the whole of
oh.
Toronto. And literally, it could be raining on your side of the street and not on the other side of the street because it has to draw a line somewhere.
Exactly, Ted. And you've got it right. In that kind of situation you explained, that would be an accurate forecast. It rained in that listening area, but because it didn't rain in your front yard, you think they screwed up again, like you say. So
Yeah,
it
I know, I
shows
know.
you that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But that is trying
Yeah,
to interpret or understand what is meant by that forecast is a
yeah,
very
yeah.
important education that we keep trying to tell the public. But,
Well, if you think you're affected by the weather, and I don't think you, David, but anybody listening, if you think your job is affected by the weather and it makes it more difficult when you're not sure exactly what it's going to be like, consider. I did an interview, and we're going to be airing it soon with James Hinchcliffe, who's a race car driver, a Canadian boy from Oakville. He races in the Indy Racing Series. Well, the biggest race that they race every year is in Indianapolis, at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which is 2.5 miles long. It's an oval, and we discussed this, the how the track conditions at one end of the track, it can
oh,
literally be raining and it's not raining at the other end of the track, or the winds are 15 kilometers an hour versus 42 kilometers an hour. And when you're driving a car at 240 miles an hour, 230 miles an hour, that change in weather means a hell of a
oh,
lot.
for sure. A beautiful example. And we can see that within a city when you have lake breezes and land breezes, or you have the escarpment, or you have the built up area versus not. I mean, all these microclimates exist within the Toronto area. And I often say you can wear out your body changing clothes driving from one part of the city to the other. I mean, you can have four seasons in one city. It truly is
Yeah.
vast. It changes.
You know, something that really confuses a lot of people. There are a lot of people here in Toronto who drive to Buffalo for sporting events and for dining and shopping, etc., and vice versa. And you'll leave Toronto and you think, okay, it's a beautiful sunny day, and you get to Buffalo and it's just a complete wipeout, and it's an hour and 40 minutes away, and vice versa. I mean, as close as we are, boy, sometimes we're like hundreds of miles away,
Well, it just shows you
thousands of miles
exactly
away.
the effect of the lake and all those other controls like escarpment and wind direction, elevation, even soil type. We've seen in parts of southwestern Ontario in the sandy soil can be very different kind of conditions than above the clay zone. So my sense is that we live in an area where we have, if you don't like the weather out your front door, look out your back door. I mean, it really does change here on a dime.
Yeah,
And the Great Lakes has an effect on that, both in the winter, more in the winter than I think in the summer. But certainly you can, well, say a warm temperature in Toronto, my gosh, it can be 27, 28 degrees at Pearson, but down by the Toronto Island, it could be 10 degrees. And just that, the
yeah.
fact that the lake is still in very cold conditions with that off lake wind can really chill the air. And so people are in bathing suits to the north of the 401, and they're wondering where is the warm weather going to come from?
David Phillips is an award winning author. He is a recipient of the Order of Canada. He is also the senior climatologist for Environment Canada. And it is always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you very much for taking the time. I hope you have a fabulous summer, filled with whatever kind of weather and climate you wish.
Thank you, Ted. That's a wonderful way of ending. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, as I always do with you.
We'll talk soon. And there you go. So now you know exactly what to expect. I mean, it's exactly right down to the millimeter of, no, that's a good idea, though. You know, Dave's been with us a number of times over the last year or so when we're doing this podcast. And boy, I look back on the things that he has predicted. He's pretty damn close, let me tell you. So what you heard is probably what you're going to get. And what you're going to get if you log on to www.tedwallishin.ca is a list of all the podcasts that we've done so far. Opportunity for you to sign up as well and fire off any questions or comments that you may have to us, and we'll be more than happy to get back to you. And we're going to be having some cool contests coming up very shortly. So again, that's www.tedwallishin.ca. In the meantime, go online and fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. And have a great week.
The Ted Wallachin Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. The Ted Wallachin Podcast is produced by me, Becky Coles. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more information on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwallishin.ca.